Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much for running this session, Paul. Thanks so much, Dave, for drafting the brilliant guide. And I got to thank the Access Committee for Leeds for their sort of inspirational work, Tim and Dave and Kirsty, who you've heard. Kirsty, who said everything that I was going to say, so has shortened what I need to contribute greatly. I'm at Leeds, at the School of Law. I'm a lawyer, and a bit of my talk is going to be about the law. And my chair in law at Leeds is funded by a disabled children's charity called Cerebra. And we're interested in problem solving without going to courts, basically, using the law without having to have a lawyer. And we've worked with the Access Committee over the last 5 or 6 years, although huge amount of this work has been done by the Access Committee and their enormous skills. What I wanted to do was to look at the statutory background very briefly, and only because it in a way demonstrates that what we're talking about is a systems problem. And systems thinking is largely about the mistake of thinking that something is simple when actually the system is quite complex. And the law, to a degree, doesn't make that problem because it sees that adaptations are both a social and a housing issue and many other issues. So the core duty, if we were to describe it for disabled children, to facilitate adaptations is under the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act. And for adults, that would be the Care Act. These are social care duties. The Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act is 1970. It wasn't until 1989 that Disabled Facilities Grants came in, DFGs, and they're now located in the Housing Grants, Construction and Regeneration Act. And these are the two main duties. There are other duties we've heard from regulatory reform orders and so on. And the Ombudsman's repeatedly reminding councils that this isn't just a housing office function, this is a social care function as well, and that it's unlawful for social services to forget that they have equally primary duties to facilitate, to fund adaptations. And as we've already heard, that the focus so much of adaptations is on access, but the Act is quite clear that it's also to make sure that the property is safe for the disabled person or other occupants. And as Debbie's made quite clear too, that DFGs really don't work for children in small houses by using a lounge or bedroom. You need an external, an extension. And of course that means that that's going to be much more expensive. The average cost of a disabled facilities grant for a disabled child is very many times more than that is for elderly people, where it's largely a stair lift, I mean, a stair lift or something like that. So quickly moving on to the research we did with the Access Committee, we had a sample of parents with disabled children whose behavior challenged, children, young people with autism, in one large unitary authority, which made it simpler. And we analyzed this over sort of a period of time, not only whether they got the grants, but what the benefits were from it. And I think it's the only research that's been done on the cost benefits of disabled facilities grants for, or adaptations for disabled children. And what we showed in the research, that for expenditure during the period of the research of £300,000, the local authority itself saved 1.5 million. So there was a 5-fold benefit from spending, for every pound you spent, you saved 5. That was based on the idea that many of these disabled children, unfortunately, with profoundly challenging behavior, do end up as looked after children, and delaying or avoiding altogether the chance of a young person becoming a looked after child will save residential care costs. And we estimated a residential care cost was 1,500 a week for children in that, young people in that situation. In fact, the figure is was well over twice that. The average figure at the moment for a residential care cost for a young person is nearly £4,000 a week, and it can go up to £25,000 a week. Other research has been done on disabled facilities grants, but for adults. So interesting piece of research was OK and others in Neathport, Talbot, 10 years ago, showed that for just over 1 million investment, there was £12.5 million saving to the local authority alone. So that's 12-fold, and that's not far off what in today's figures would have been our research. And they adopt a systems thinking approach in their research too, which is one I'm going to talk about briefly in a minute. And during our research, we came across unpublished work done by the Isle of Wight Council, where they had done pretty detailed costings to show that their disabled facilities grants expenditure made net annual savings for that authority each year of 13.5 million. So in a way, there's no argument on the basis of the research that disabled facilities grants are spectacularly effective in saving local authorities money. And we don't really need to argue that anymore, because the Treasury is completely convinced on that. The Treasury put money into the Better Care Fund each year, and that has, I mean, Paul and Dave will know better than me, but the Better Care Fund contributions for disabled facilities grants has more than doubled since 2015, despite the massive cuts that have been made to local authority budgets in that time. It's one of the very few bits of expenditure that has gone up dramatically. And largely that's to do with saving the NHS money, increasing the speed of people's discharge from hospitals to better adapted homes. And we were discussing this, I was discussing this the other day with the Access Committee, with a large housing authority. And the officer we were talking to said this, and this is a case that's had some publicity, that in 2018, they funded an adaptation that cost £165,000. That's the largest adaptation they've funded, and it's the largest one I've ever heard of. And it's a progressive local authority. It's one that does sort of get it sometimes and sometimes doesn't get it. But he said that expenditure of £165,000 had been paid off within 5.5 months. And that the average residential cost would have been £7,500 a week. And this is a point that Kirsty made really forcibly, that these may sound like large sums of money, but it would be a madness for a local authority not to spend it, given that the consequences would be £7,000 or £8,000 a week. And the housing officer said that he thought that the expenditure was a no-brainer. And I've never come across a housing officer, or indeed a local authority officer at a senior level, that hasn't accepted that. But the housing manager would then say in the next breath that that his job or her job depends on staying within budget. And therefore, although they know in their bones that this money makes sense, they will refuse DFGs because they have got to not pay over their budgets. And I've just written a book on this issue, and one of the quotes from that is, who got promoted for putting their agency's future second? That you prioritize the housing budget, even though that might cause mayhem for your social care budget. And I'm not going to go through this, you'll get this, but we still have this toxic approach in utterly self-defeating process of local authorities refusing to go above 30,000, forcing families to borrow the money. Families that, if they can't cope, their child would be looked after at a huge expense to the local authority. Utterly self-defeating, but it's all too common an experience for me as a lawyer. So what does systems thinking say about this? Well, it's really the obvious point, and Kirsty has already mentioned it, that we can't think in terms of single silos. If you put your systems boundary around the housing budget, then each year it spends money out. So it's made a £70,000 DFG to a family, and at the end of that year, once its budget's spent, it closes the book and people have to wait until the next year. But everything that a housing officer spends from the budget is net expenditure. There are no benefits. The fact that spending £70,000 a year for one family might save social services £70,000 this year and £70,000 next year and the year after. The fact that that makes a huge financial saving for authority, if it's both a housing and a social services authority, is irrelevant to the housing officer, because these are two separate budgets. They're dealt as simple systems, whereas in fact they have loopbacks. They are complex systems. So one expenditure on the left will save a lot of money on the right. Now, you wouldn't think that it was beyond the wit of a senior officer, a chief executive officer, to draw the systems boundary around both those authorities so that social services could via money to housing budgets. But something as simple as that seems to be completely beyond the ability of incredibly well-paid senior officers within local authorities. So we have the housing budget, as I've just said, that it just is net expenditure. It doesn't see benefits from it doesn't see economic benefits from funding adaptations to disabled facilities grants. You have the social services budget that gets huge benefits, but also has huge losses if housing refuse to fund adaptations unless social services do it themselves. And those are really the only bits that have been looked at in much of the research. But we know that there are huge benefits to the NHS. We know that because the Treasury is prioritising disabled facilities grants because it wants to free up hospital beds. And we heard from Tracy, from Kirsty, that lots of children like her son would end up in accident emergency through PICA, through eating inappropriate things. When we were doing the research, we didn't look at the NHS. We didn't look at the police budget either. On one occasion, one of the children, young people, was capable of climbing vertical surfaces and running faster than Usain Bolt. And we were trying to cost out what a police helicopter cost for 2 hours. And of course, many young people with sensory impairments end up within the criminal justice system at huge cost. Huge cost to the Social Security budget, as families with disabled children are not able to work because they are caring 24/7. And of course, there's the huge personal impact on the family. At the moment, all we've done is to put those two together and show between 5 and 12-fold benefit for local authorities. But if you add all these other issues, if you would have to do in a systems thinking approach, you can see that expenditure from a housing budget of relatively small sums of money of 70,000 or 160,000 have phenomenally the multiplier effects within the whole complex system that is the public service. And really the challenge is for officers, I think, at all levels within local authorities to have those conversations. And I think that having those conversations, that one just doesn't really just focus on the UK budget, would be much better off for that. But we shouldn't lose sight of families. And my frustration acting in many of these cases as a lawyer is that families aren't listened to, that they're told that their problems aren't as they describe it. We shouldn't really forget, and that's why I'm so grateful for foundations today, starting with Kirsty's experience. We shouldn't forget families, the transformative impact of DFGs on families, of parents being able to work, and we should never forget the impact on siblings and obviously people like Charlie. So thanks, I rushed through that, but I hope it's of some help.
Yes, thank you, Luke. I think that there's kind of a couple of questions that came in for the DFG surgery, but while you're here, I think it'd be useful to discuss a couple of them if we could. Kind of one that we'd had beforehand and has kind of cropped up in the chat box, I think, throughout this afternoon, is that kind of people asking, can we do this? Can we do particular adaptations as part of a DFG? And some of them were kind of specific in terms of things like a de-escalation room, a breakout room, a sensory room, a further bedroom, an enclosed and secured soft play garden. Would they be mandatory or discretionary? I think kind of my view is that's not really the question, that the kind of each person is different, and the DFG gives you a duty to consider that the purpose of making the home safer, and any of those could be necessary and appropriate in the particular circumstances, but it's almost impossible to say that one is or one isn't kind of eligible for a DFG more generically than that.
Question to me.
Well, yeah, I suppose.
yeah. I mean, the point is this, that the primary duty to make DFGs comes from the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act. And under the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act, the local authority can fund anything it likes, and it can pay the full cost. I mean, normally local authorities don't charge for that. Of course, DFG is more constrained, and you have this sort of process of OTs having to assess. But under the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act, the local authority can fund anything it likes that it thinks is needed. So all the things that you've just described are available under that. If you need housing to chip in 30,000, then you will have to jump through some of the hoops. But as you say, it's a personalised assessment.
Absolutely. I think kind of Briar's question was around independent OTs and how they fit into the DFG process. I know quite a lot of local authorities that they kind of almost disregard private OT assessments in other areas, that they accept them. But I think kind of the guidance is quite clear that it's a housing decision when a DFG is approved, and the guidance is clear that you can accept a private OT's assessment.
Yeah, there's nothing in the legislation that requires an OT to be anywhere near it. Yeah. All the legislation says is that before a housing authority makes a decision, it's got to consult social services. But there's nothing in the legislation to say that it's got to be an OT. And actually, the Ombudsman has frequently said, you know, if there's a huge waiting list for OTs, then don't use them.
Yes, absolutely. And I think
will go private. She's said that on a couple of occasions. Yeah. So of course the local authority can if it wants. And then when we were doing this research, the local authority was using the OT waiting list as a reason for delaying making a payment. And so these payments can take up to 3 or 4 years. And one of the mothers that we were talking about, she was saying, if we don't get that DFG, if we don't get the adaptation within 6 months, my son is going to end up in care. I love him dearly, but we just can't cope. They didn't get that adaptation, and the young man did go into care, you know, at thousands of pounds a week. So it wasn't theoretical, it was true. And playing this game is, we've got to do the assessment, we've got to do it ourselves, is a very expensive game.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And the kind of question of the upper limit as well is something that we're going to be returning to later in the year. And there's a couple of questions in the chat box. But again, I see quite a lot of local authorities won't even consider a grant over £30,000, and I kind of fettering their discretion. Did you come across many of those in your cases?
Well, I mean, not in the research we did, but we were working with a big unitary authority that I've got a lot of time for, actually. But yeah, I mean, of course, the Ombudsman's casebook on Disabled Facilities Grant, which you can just access online, is littered with we can't do this, we won't do that, we'll only do this in exceptional circumstances of grave hardship. All of those things, you know, are invitations for lawyers to sue. But it happens all the time. And of course, very few people know, like you have just pointed out, that's a fettering of a discretion or a duty. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you again, Luke. It's been a pleasure as always. And I'll look up your book. Actually, it sounds good. Read. I'll look that up after today's webinar. So, thank you again.
Okay, thanks you.